At a time when truth and transparency matter more than ever, local journalism remains a cornerstone of democracy. It amplifies underrepresented voices, sheds light on critical issues, and ensures that those in power remain accountable to the people they serve. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from Pulitzer-honored journalists who have dedicated their careers to uncovering truth and highlighting narratives that otherwise might have been hidden, altered, or erased altogether. This visit is especially powerful for our student journalists who had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have a classroom visit today. And they were one-on-one with our panelists who were able to answer questions, and we gleaned a lot of insight from that. I can tell you that in this community, we have incredible podcasters, journalists, documentarians, and storytellers. And now they are even more inspired. So thank you, Pulitzer. Thank you, Stocktonia. Thank you, Delta College.
I'm Marjorie Miller. I'm the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, which I would say is the coolest job I've ever had, except I really felt like that about every job I've had in journalism. And I think our panelists would say the same tonight. I spent most of my life in newsrooms first as a reporter, including on the U.S.-Mexico border, and then as an editor, and I managed several Pulitzer-winning projects. So I have a stake in this organization, and I believe in it, and I'm excited to be here to spread the word. Let's start with Caitlin. Caitlin, we're living in extraordinary times, to say the least. In such an environment where you have so much change happening so fast at the national level, going down to the local level, obviously in your area of immigration and the border, how does anyone decide what to cover?
Well, it's undoubtedly overwhelming, and I think there's no way to be working as a journalist right now and not kind of question the choice of story that you end up sticking with, because there is so much going on. But as an investigative reporter, my inclination is always to stick with it and not just cover a change as it's announced, but find out what its consequences are a week later, a month later, a year later. And so even though it's always a hard call, I think being able to stick with a story until you feel like it's done is almost as important as the selection. When it comes to story selection, I internalized early in my time as a reporter this three-pronged test that my editor would talk about applying to every potential story. Is it original? Because there's no reason to spend time reporting something that someone else already has. Is it possible? Because sometimes you might have a tip or a hunch about a really powerful story, but there's no way that you can get the sources that you need to confirm it. There's no documentary evidence to make sure that it's true. And so you don't want to spend too much time on something you can't prove. And then does it matter, right? Is it going to really impact people's lives in a concrete way? I think to that, I would probably add something about whether or not the story is suited for me and my expertise. You know, why should I be the one to tell this story and not someone else? Because yes, as you said, there's so many different things happening in the world of immigration and so many people covering immigration. So just as an example, I spent the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024 reporting for a cover story that ran in the Atlantic about migration through the Darien Gap. And migration through the Darien Gap had been up, so I'm talking about this narrow strip of land that connects Colombia to Panama, and it's the only way to physically walk north toward the United States from South America. So for a very long time, almost no one had entered the Darien Gap. It was sort of this place that had this mythical reputation because people, whether they were colonizers or people trying to start businesses, would enter the Darien Gap, and I'm talking going back more than 100 years, and would disappear, would perish, because the landscape is incredibly treacherous. You have just about every risk to your life that you can imagine, from deadly snakes to spiders to falls. It's easy to slip and fall in the Darien Gap. There are flash floods on a daily basis, and it's very easy to drown in the Darien Gap. But it over the course of the last 10 years has become a migration route. And there was some really phenomenal journalism done about the Darien Gap as those numbers started to increase. So of course I'm interested as an immigration reporter, but for a while it really didn't feel like my story to tell. There were people who were experts in the region who were based there and who could go and tell the story on the ground. People who had, there were periods of time when the Darien Gap was growing in importance, but I was covering breaking news, and so I obviously didn't have the resources or the time to do it. But after years and years of migration through the Darien Gap growing to the extent that more than 200,000 people were crossing in just 1 year alone, I felt like it was time for me to go, because by then I had started to learn about these other dynamics of global migration that I had covered in the past that really were giving rise to this situation. So I went there and reported what it was like to cross the Darien Gap, but I also fleshed out aspects of this phenomenon that hadn't been written about quite as much. So, the criminal organizations that were making huge amounts of money by perpetuating this migration, and how that, because that actually had been written about, but how that became in itself a driver, because these cartels were advertising, reporting through the Darien Gap like it was a walk in the park. And so more and more people were buying packages as if they were buying vacation packages to go. I focused a lot on the policies, U.S. government policies pressuring Latin American countries to shut off visas that also gave rise to the situation, because when it became more difficult to get visas in Central America, it's not that people stopped migrating, they just pushed them south, and so they had to walk all the way up to Mexico to try to enter the United States as opposed to being able to fly or take a boat. I used my investigative chops to write about the deaths in the Darien Gap, which I found were being significantly undercounted. So I just tried to think about whether or not there was something that I could bring to the table that others hadn't, and that helps too, I think, when you're trying to decide what story to pursue.
On the issue of what it takes to produce a story like this, or in fact the story you just described, can you really walk us through all, how do you get the material? How do you get sources? How long did it take? How much money does it take to do that kind of reporting?
So that was an incredibly labor-intensive investigation, time-intensive investigation, and money, frankly. And it started in 2017 when I, as a reporter at the New York Times, began to hear about migrant children and their parents being separated at the border, and I started to reach out to officials at the Department of Homeland Security and ask them about these cases, if they could confirm them and if they could explain why these families were being separated. And for a long time, to sort of make a long story short, I and other journalists were told that these really weren't family separations weren't happening, nothing had changed about the government's process for dealing with families as they tried to cross the border, which immediately didn't seem to be true, right? It ran in the face of individual accounts that I was getting with specific detail, names, sometimes photographs, identification numbers from lawyers who were saying separations had occurred. And so I immediately started to file public records requests at the time, just to try to get to the bottom of whether any separations were taking place and what had changed. And little did I know I would be litigating those requests for many years. And when I launched into a big magazine investigation, so I put down all my individual incremental news stories that I had written for the New York Times and began this investigative work with The Atlantic, we were still litigating these public records requests and eventually got back thousands of documents. So that is a lot of money right there in the years that lawyers had to spend going back and forth and using their billable hours with the Department of Homeland Security to get them to turn over documents. Of course, when we first got those documents that explained, or that began to explain, just what was going on with family separations. What was the plan? Who had called for these to take place? How did we go from just a few? They started with a trickle, and then you all may remember when Jeff Sessions came forward and announced in a press conference here in California, in San Diego, that the Department of Homeland Security was going to begin a large-scale family separation project, which is how we got to thousands of them. So the records started to tell that story, but really, when I first got them, they didn't make much sense to me. They were calendar entries, they were snippets of emails that didn't make sense out of context. And so I started my process with literally a huge stack of paper that I printed out and just laid out covering the floor of my apartment in Brooklyn. I put them in chronological order, thinking maybe if I put these in order, then I'll be able to tell what's going on here. I still really couldn't tell what was going on. So what I did was digitize those documents in chronological order, and then begin to fill in the blanks in between. So I started with several Inspector General reports that had been published explaining different aspects of the family separation program. I looked at the contemporaneous reporting in national and local outlets that also told parts of the story, put those into my digital chronology, and then I set out to do interviews. And I started out with a list of maybe 75 people I wanted to talk to, and then I think by the time I finished with the story, I had double that number. And so I began to do interviews and slot information from those interviews into the chronology, as well as check the information from the interviews against what the chronology showed, and in particular against what the original public records showed, right? So not somebody's memory or how they want, to shape the story after the fact to make themselves sound better, but what do the original records show? And after all of that, I had a story. Does that do it? It was really dizzying.
I just want to jump in because you talked about the public records request that took years to do.
Yeah.
That is a really common tactic for public officials who don't want the public to know what's going on, to immediately deny public records requests and try to wait the journalist out. You were really lucky. You were working for the New York Times and the Atlantic, who could afford the attorneys to wait that out. But that's a very real problem in local journalism around the country, are just the tactic of denying records and seeing if the journalist will do anything about it.
I was so fortunate to have that support. And there are groups like the Reporters Committee for the Free Press and even Investigative Reporters and Editors, which is a national organization that supports investigative reporting, that does have some support for local outlets where their bosses don't have the money, but they have really important stories. It's also a challenge, though, even when you have the financial support, when you're a beat reporter, to stick with your public records request, because you send something off and you won't hear anything for months. And so for years, I've had reminders on my calendar every Friday to check in on my public records requests, because you can forget about them. Like, I was constantly being pulled from one story to another. And then to have dropped on your head all of a sudden, 500 pages when you've got 3 assignments that are due, even that can be a barrier. So I had this habit of just sneaking up to the legal floor at the New York Times, and I'd get a text or a call from my editor, like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'll be right there." And I had snuck up to go and talk to the lawyers, because that's what it takes.
So now we have an administration that is trying very hard to shut down access to information. They're taking down government web pages, limiting data on climate and health studies, and shutting down studies. How much harder do you think this is going to make the kind of work that you do, and in general? Is there going to be an impact, and how will you get around that?
Absolutely, there's going to be an impact. It's going to become a lot harder, and in an environment like that, sticking with litigation and getting people to pay for litigation in and of itself is going to become much more difficult. I mean, the president is suing news outlets directly for their work, and so obviously there's a chilling effect there, as well as a real concrete financial challenge presented by going head-to-head with the federal government in this moment. So I do think it's going to make our work a lot harder. And at the same time, we have another phenomenon going on, which is there's a lot of skepticism of journalists and the media, which is why we're here, and why we want to talk with you about our work and how we do it and why we do it. Because someone said it earlier, democracy can't exist without transparency, without vetted and verified information that is presented without any political motivation behind it. That's what we're here to do, but we're getting assailed, and so we need even more than, we've always needed to verify our work, but I think that the onus has only risen. We want to be able to show how we've come to the conclusions that we have in a story and provide that documentary evidence. We need to provide that documentary evidence, and now the documents are disappearing. And so it's going to make it that much more important for us to, every time we take a look at a record set, record it, save it, put it on a secure, encrypted server or place where it can't be accessed or taken down. I mean, we really have to be overzealous when it comes to keeping track of records. There's a set of data around immigration and immigration enforcement that was maintained since the 1980s by Syracuse University. It's called TRACK. It's this very boring tool that reporters who cover immigration are obsessed with. And I can't tell you how many times I've relied on TRACK in stories. I did a JSTOR search and found thousands of academic articles that have cited TRACK data. And Syracuse University recently parted ways with TRACK, which was a huge hit to us as reporters. Thankfully, it's resurfaced for now as an independent entity, but a lot of us have been trying to figure out, can another university take this website on? And the answer is probably no, because all of the data that they publish is obtained through public records requests. And they've had cases go on for more than 20 years where they're litigating back and forth with the government, all of it done by pro bono lawyers. And now with universities worried about whether or not they're going to continue to get federal funding, who wants to take something like that on? And so there's no doubt we're under a lot of pressure right now.
President Trump has sued ABC, NBC, CBS, and the Des Moines Register, to name a few organizations. And they are settling suits for millions of dollars, whether or not they think there's a legitimate case against them. And many media analysts have branded this retribution or simply an effort to intimidate journalists from investigating or writing about anything deemed unfriendly. So I'm wondering, first of all, what you're able to tell us about the suit against you, and about efforts to force you to hand over information on sources.
Yeah, so first let me say I'm really excited to be here as a community college grad and super fan of community colleges. When Marjorie told me that we were doing another event at community college, I said yes without even knowing the dates or anything. But I'd like to back up just to give a little bit of background to the story, just to kind of show how much reporting went into this story that is now, statements around the story are the subject of a lawsuit. This story started for me in 2017 when I found out that the state of Mississippi was approving just 2% of people who were applying for cash welfare. So there's a lot of parallels in the story that Caitlin told about government officials sort of creating a cloud around these topics and not providing clear answers. When I asked, how that could be in the poorest state in the country that just 2% of people were being approved, and also, by the way, where is the rest of the money going if it's not going to, needy families through cash assistance? We were just so hit roadblock after roadblock to getting the answers to those questions. Which then resulted in a bunch of records requests and trying to find out where that money was going and knocking on the doors of these nonprofits that were funneling the money away to programs that had nothing to do with lifting families out of poverty. And so eventually through the reporting, alongside the reporting, the auditor started investigating. There were arrests made in 2020. He arrested the nonprofit founder and the director of Department of Human Services who administers the funds. And, as far as the government accountability, it just stopped right there. And we knew that wasn't the whole story. We knew that this wasn't, $77 million just flew out the door unchecked. And that wasn't just the responsibility of two people. So, through our reporting, we were able to develop sources who had access to documents, and we obtained text messages were really the underlying documents to the series that I published in 2022 that won the Pulitzer. And the beauty with this series that I wrote called The Back Channel is that it really just laid out direct communications between these officials, specifically the governor and former NFL quarterback Brett Favre, talking about these projects that ended up receiving millions of federal welfare funds. And we laid it all out for the reader to decide for themselves what had happened. It lifted the curtain on something in government that we often don't get to see. It was reflected right on the page, officials talking about things they were doing in their own words. So when the Pulitzer was announced in 2023, awarding for this story, it was 2 days later that the former governor issued his first demand for retraction, alleging that we had defamed him. So it's been almost 2 years since this whole process kind of started, and we're still in the fight at this point over efforts through this lawsuit to get us to turn over source material, material that would reveal sources who turned over documents. So that, whether or not there's a case here, that's damage to the newspaper and trust between reporter and the source. So we're not going to do that. I think it's incumbent upon us to stand up for our source in that case. So this series was published in 2022, and at this point, no one had spoken a word publicly about the former governor's involvement, and really more broadly about the whole system at play here that allowed for this misspending to occur. And after our series published, there were calls on the federal DOJ to investigate, and other people implicated in the scandal began talking about the other players involved, because Mississippi Today just laid it all out there. So, they felt comfortable doing that, coming out of the woodwork. And, and then there's been policy changes too to help more families get aid. Although I do want to say that this lawsuit also has served to be a huge distraction to the fact that families in poverty in Mississippi still aren't being served the way that they should. Our approval rates are still very low, and I think we're up to about $150 million in these federal funds right now that are just sitting left unspent because of the crackdown on just funneling the money to nonprofits, but instead of actually just finding ways to use that money to help poor families, we've let it sit in the bank. So I do want to always make the point that these conversations about the First Amendment and sources, and this is very important to us, but it also, I don't want to stray away from the fact that this story illustrates such a conspiracy to keep people in poverty that remains today.
And one of the other changes at the federal level is a pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And you cover marginalized communities. Are they starting to see and feel that in Mississippi, or is it too early?
Yeah, I think, for the communities that I am most familiar with, they have not necessarily benefited from DEI in the first place, right? I'm talking about folks who are, in many cases, just locked out of employment opportunity altogether. The welfare client, the mother facing prosecution over her pregnancy outcomes. That issue has not touched them that I've seen. I do think that the larger conversation around DEI and particularly critical race theory in Mississippi, the thing that I think that I'll be looking at is something that might not be seen or felt for years or generations to come if our children are not being taught the legacy of slavery and systemic racism in Mississippi and how that really has set us up for where we are today. That's kind of what I'm worried about. If that isn't known, if that history is not understood and internalized, we have the risk of repeating it.
A lot of the students today wanted to know how you handle the stress of these jobs and, being sued, of all of the information that you both get and hear, the stories that you hear all the time that are very obviously upsetting, and you're revealing them and you're writing about them, and that's so important, but you're also bearing witness to all sorts of things. How do you deal with that, Anna?
Yeah, we've been talking about this today. I think, I'll skip all the self-care stuff and just say that it's really about refocusing on why we're doing what we're doing and the impact that we're able to have, and getting some perspective through that. Because I think that these attacks can make us feel so involved in ourselves, so worried about, my reputation, or what is this going to mean for me or my career or something like that. And that's just not really what we're in it for. So remembering who we do it for, and that the challenges that we face pale in comparison to the kinds of things that the people that we cover are going through, and really centering them. If I could just share a quick example of a story that it also speaks to story selection and why, how we choose the stories that we do. In 2023, I started looking at cases where local prosecutors were prosecuting women for using drugs while pregnant. So their child, when born, may have tested positive at birth. And regardless of whether they were harmed or not, the mother could be facing felony charges of child abuse, assault, crimes that carry, many years in prison, up to 20 years in prison in some cases. And we started looking at those particularly because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, of course, and looking at how pregnancy could be criminalized and prosecuted following that. And this is something that's been going on, prior to that, but we wanted to take a real, good statewide look at how often this was occurring. And we reached out to many women that we found in the course of our reporting, but it's so hard to talk about these issues that are so stigmatized. I mean, it's difficult to find a source who's willing to share that kind of story. So we published a story that talked about, the local sheriff and why he was going after these women, and published that. And then about 6 months later, I got an email from a woman who was going through this, and she was wanting to share her story. And it was so, it was horrible what she was going through. It was also great that she felt like she could talk about it. And it was the first time that I'd really spoken to someone who had a story, a full story that they could share about this topic. Went up and interviewed her. Then, instead of just, quickly going with the story as it was, went up and interviewed the local prosecutor who was prosecuting her, and had a real genuine conversation with him. Sat down, really tried to understand where he was coming from, and talking about all the implications on reproductive rights. And at the end of our conversation, and as he thought about what we had talked about, he changed his mind. He dropped the charges against this woman. He decided that he wasn't going to prosecute these cases anymore. In the course of our reporting, we had found that 4 women from his small district were currently incarcerated for up to 20 years. So this was while I was reporting it. These women are in prison, and our story published in December, and by January, all of the women were released. So when you think about the people that can be impacted by the work, that's just what you have to focus on, because there's no award or prize that can really come close to when I received that phone call here just recently to learn that.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I promised in advertising this event that we would talk about the relationship between the public and journalists, and how we really want it to feel like a two-way street. I mean, you in your communities are our eyes and ears. You're how we find out about stories, or how we understand that something we might have thought was a one-off case isn't, and it's something systemic. So please keep with you the story that Anna just shared about the woman who decided to come forward and email, because you might think that, oh, these journalists aren't going to read my note if I write to them, or they're not going to pick up the phone, they're too busy, or they might be uninterested. The opposite is true. I mean, we live for these emails and direct communication with the communities that we cover. We couldn't do our stories without you. And so I think, too, that's really important in this moment when it's kind of, I feel like, become cool to bag on the press and bag on journalists. But if you think that your local news outlet could be doing better, please reach out to us and tell us, because we just may not know, and we want to do the best job that we possibly can. We want to know about these stories. So I just wanted to put a finer point on that communication and kind of leave you with a call to action if possible.
So, Nicole, you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of organizations and journalists, and I'm wondering if you feel that those attacks, or you see or you measure in any way the impact of those attacks on trust in the media.
So there's research out there that talks about local news is more trusted than national news. And the reason is because you know these students. You know Caitlin, or you know Anna, or you know me. We go to church together. Our kids are at school together. So that's why when we have, decline of local news, it's really important, because as you look at just the acrimony going on at the national level, local is where we can still have conversations. Local is when we can get together in a room and talk through things. Want to add on to the lawsuit piece as well. I know we don't want to make it about us, but these lawsuits make it hard for us to do that job and to have that trust. And I wanted to point out that here in California, and you may be aware of this, you're very lucky. A lot of these lawsuits are nuisance suits, and they're called SLAP suits. And I have what that stands for because I can never remember. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. So that is when a public official or somebody is suing you just to make you stop. And if you don't have legal representation, it may make you stop. Here in California, you have an anti-SLAP law, which means if you get sued, you can go to a judge and say, I think this is retaliatory. They have to look at that within 30 days. If they agree that it's retaliatory, they make the person who brought the lawsuit pay all your legal fees. And it is a fantastic tool. So congratulations, California. Like, that is amazing. It's really important, really, really important. When we talk about trust, I really, truly believe the answer is local news and transparency, that we've got to do a better job. And that's, again, why we are sitting here, of telling you how we do our jobs and why we do them, and explaining the decisions that are being made.
Let's talk a little bit about misinformation and fact-checking. And, Meta, I'm sure you all have heard, have stopped their fact-checking operation. What do we do about that? And how do we help the public understand the difference between information and misinformation?
Right. First of all, huge shout out to Delta for the media literacy work you're doing right here at Delta. Great job. Great job. Great job. It actually is proven to make a difference. That if you can get that into the schools, if you can get people to stop and think before they share and look at the source and think about the source of information, all the things you're teaching, it truly makes a difference. One of the things I find fascinating is there is a difference between mis and disinformation. So misinformation may or may not have intent. It could be your uncle sharing something that he thinks is true, but it's not, and he's just, a goofball. Disinformation are people actively seeking to mislead you. And there's a reason that disinformation is so sticky. It's a reason that it works so well. First of all, that it can often confirm our biases. It's repeated over and over and over, and there's just something in the brain that when something's repeated that often, it begins to stick. And it's also about information overload. When we are bombarded with so much information every day, how many times have you heard, I don't know what to believe. I don't know who to believe. So the person who's saying it the most and the loudest is the one that sticks into your brain. And finally, we know that the algorithms are targeting us. So the minute you slow down on a video about the election results of 2020, that's all you're going to get fed. So social media is actively working to spread disinformation. But here's the solution. It's trust and transparency. Again, research shows that the media literacy campaigns work. The other thing that works, the most important thing about countering misinformation is when somebody you trust tells you it's not true. So that can be a local journalist, that can be Anna, that can be Caitlin, that can be your elected officials who you trust, it can be a student, it can be a friend, but it's up to all of us to, when you see something, to say, you know what, that's not true, here's the truth in your personal life, and especially as journalists, to develop that trusted relationship with the community, so when Stocktonia tells you something's not true, you believe it because you trust them.
Journalism has gotten a lot riskier since you went into the business with these lawsuits, with doxing, with physical attacks, with people trying to discredit your name and you. And so what do you say to these students about why they should go into journalism today? And would you make the same decision today, Caitlin?
I'm sure that I would. I mean, I think journalism is, some people say it's a calling, it might be a sickness, I don't know, but I can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, I first became interested in becoming a journalist when I was in college, and that was really when I was developing my kind of political identity as an American. I was learning on a deeper level how things worked in this country, and because I wasn't studying journalism, but my major required reading a ton of news, I started to think really hard about this incredible role that journalists play in being the providers of information, arming the electorate to be able to make decisions that were informed, whether it's their decisions on how they vote or how they invest, how they volunteer, and I just thought that was the most amazing thing as soon as it clicked, and felt like I wanted to get involved, like I wanted to play that role. I mean, I think growing up in Merced is probably part of that. Merced is isolated, and in a lot of ways I don't have to tell you all, but we have issues with literacy, we have issues with crime, we have issues with environmental exposure and illnesses that result from it. I mean, the communities in this part of the state in general can be ignored so much in the national media and even within the state, but there's so much going on. There's so many wonderful stories, and there's also so much inequality and so much suffering and even unnecessary suffering. And so to be able to bring those stories to light, I think, is just such a privilege. So I can't imagine not doing it, and I would encourage you to keep going.
It's really funny because I'm thinking about your question, and I'm thinking for the first time that if the younger me could see where I am right now, and it's been like a lot of heartache, right? But I think she'd think it was really badass. So obviously, do it again. But yeah, same. Like, we're so fortunate to be in this position to do the work that we're doing. That has to trump like any of the feeling of fear or, weighing the risk. I just feel really grateful to be able to do it.
I look at these two badass women. Caitlin's work on child separation was the definitive answer to what happened. We were all so confused at the time. She lifted the veil through many years and thousands of records, and she pointed out that not only was it intentional, it was intentionally cruel. And her reporting let us know that as a fact. And I look at Anna, who she got food on the table for kids, and she put rent, and a roof over people's heads, and you got 4 women out of jail. And I look at the work your student journalists are doing, and covering the different ballot measures and the role of adjunct faculty on your campus, and you hear these stories and the difference they make, and who wouldn't want to be a journalist? Like, who you get to do this incredibly precious, very special job that's really, really hard, but when you hear stories like that, it's very much worth it.
So much of what political writers and analysts are saying now is that for some reason, it feels like, whereas in the past, all politics used to be local politics, all national politics are local politics. The conversation is happening at 30,000 feet. Part of that is because of how diminished local news outlets have become. But I think it's so important and so it's great that you're here today, and as our local reporters who cover Stockton, and give them your number if you would afterward, and hopefully they can not just speak with you, but your colleagues as well, because yes, I mean, when the voters of Stockton go to pick a president or pick their senators or pick anybody who's going to be working even on the federal level, they should know how the issues that they're considering will literally affect their community. They shouldn't be voting based on just a gut feeling about a concept in the abstract that they can't really picture the consequences of. And so it's really important for reporters and for national outlets as well. We should all be speaking with people in communities where we can see the impacts of these policies so that people can make informed decisions.
I just want to add on that it's also equally important for the folks in DC to know the real impact on the ground. I mean, they're really going on a, move fast and break things, and they really don't know what's happening out there. And so by telling your story, we're informing them, which can inform the entire policy debate. So it's important in both directions. Thank you so much for bringing that.
Yeah, I think I'm starting a new beat to cover the city of Jackson, right? And I'm thinking about what all that means and what stories to tell. And, I think that when people hear that, they're like, oh, you're going to be at City Hall covering like city council and decisions that city leaders are making. And I don't think that's it. I think that we have to like really be intentional about looking at every level. So it's all about what, is going on in the lives of Jacksonians and what level of government is responsible for that outcome. So, I'm thinking about like a massive amount of rental assistance that we received as a result of the pandemic, and the state, governor who sent that money back, and all of the people who were evicted in Jackson as a result of that didn't get to access that $300 and something million that was sent back. Really, I think the most important thing is pinpointing who's accountable for what. And that doesn't just mean like on the city level, but on the state level and the federal level.
And I think with, I could just add to, with immigration, what that looks like here is I've seen some stories and coverage of arrests that have started to take place, of fear, but I think it's really important for reporters to stick with the story and go deep. I mean, it's really difficult because there's a real risk in coming forward as a source right now if you're an undocumented person or you have undocumented people in your home. And so we as journalists need to be intentional and make sure that we're not putting people at risk by writing about them, but there are ways to do that still allow you to tell a really deep, granular story that conveys the impact. Mm-hmm. So I get a little frustrated when I see stories that say 3 people were arrested outside of a church on Saturday, or 10 people were arrested on a farm, and 2 of them had U.S. citizen children who are 2 and 4 years old, and then that's it. The coverage ends there. It's like, go to the person's house. If you can go to the person's house, understand what it means to have the breadwinner of a home plucked out of a household, perhaps somebody who's lived in the United States for 10 or 20 or 30 years, who has, like I said, U.S. citizen children who are left behind, and you might have an undocumented spouse who's then trying to figure out how to move forward without their partner. I mean, there's so many different scenarios, but we have to make these stories real so that, again, when people are deciding how they feel about policy, they're doing it armed with good information, because I've seen this happen before, but again and again now, people are saying in stories that I've read, I voted for Trump because I didn't think that he was going to arrest X type of person, but he has, and I'm confused. And so that means that we need to be doing a better job at reporting on these issues before they become reality so that people can make informed decisions.
So I'm a lead facilitator in my ethnic studies course here. And so I work a lot with first-year college students. And even like in this room, for example, too, I feel like there's a large disconnect between the younger generation and the older generation in terms of how much they care about raising awareness about issues and like the current political climate. And I feel like these students don't realize how it's truly affecting them and their futures or even their own families. So what do you feel like, I guess to, organize my question, what is a good reminder for the youth to realize that there is importance in raising awareness and in having these conversations and bringing change?
It is our jobs to help people understand whether they're young people or whether they're just people who think, oh, my life has nothing to do with immigration or has nothing to do with the policies or the practices of the local prosecutor or nothing to do with the border wall. Like, it's our job to frame stories in a way that make clear why they matter, because there are many stories unfolding in Stockton right now that have a hugely significant impact on first-year college students, stories that affect what they're paying for tuition, what they're learning in class, what health care they have access to, the businesses that they go to feed themselves and get their school supplies. I mean, there's so many things happening in Stockton that are relevant to young people. And so I can't give you a specific answer because it really does depend on the story, but it's something that we could all do a better job at, and we just have to constantly be reminding ourselves we shouldn't be framing stories in a way that we think is the most interesting. We should be framing stories in a way that makes really clear why they're so important to readers. And if we can't make a case that they're important, then we need to move on. Then we haven't met that does it matter test, right? And we need to move on to something that does matter.
People don't remember statistics, they remember stories. When you hear the story about the 4 women who got out of jail, you're going to remember that. So I think it's incumbent on us to get to your generation and hear your stories and tell your specific stories, because then you're going to get engaged. If you just hear all these numbers and people are mad and it's easy to let it wash over you. So I appreciate your comment, and I take that as a call to action on our part.
My source of frustration with journalists is when it is a lie, call it a lie. So we start feeling frustrated with journalists that we don't think are covering, that are giving a pass to people who should not be given a pass. How do we hold journalists accountable so that we can build a trust with you and so that we can get the information that we want and that we think needs to be out there, because there are many, many lies going around there that are not all lies.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm curious what sources I'm curious what journalists you're talking about.
It's mostly nightly news.
Right.
And I realize that's different from your type of journalism. And I read a lot of written journalism, but you're what we have. So I'm asking you the question.
I think, dare I wade into the debate over lie? I know that's a word that a lot of people care really strongly about on both directions. And I guess my personal perspective on that is that lie connotes the idea that not only is what you're hearing untrue, but that it's being, this person is actively it's intentional, this person is actively trying to mislead you. And so as a journalist, I'm always going to naturally recoil from that in a little bit, because my whole job is to convey unassailable facts, things that I can prove, and I can't prove what's in somebody else's head. And so that is why you, I think, have seen at least some journalists and journalistic outlets decide to hold back from the lie and instead say, X official said this today, what's actually true is that, or use some other word that doesn't assume that this person is intentionally trying to mislead people. I mean, it's really a well-intentioned approach to trying to, it's kind of this example of what we always talk about, we're giving you the facts and telling you what reality is so that you can decide how to feel about it. If I say to you that someone is lying, there's this implication that I'm saying to you, and you shouldn't trust them or vote for them or support them. And it feels like a really strong stance to be taking. And so I think that's why you see people hanging back from it sometimes. I mean, at the same time, though, there was a big debate about lie early on in President Trump's first term, and I was at the New York Times at the time, which wasn't really using the term lie, nor were other major national outlets, but some did evolve over time. And so I think just responding in the way that you are, whether you've written emails or you responded to people on Twitter, we do, like I said, we do take your notes seriously, and we appreciate the feedback, and I have seen some evolution there. So I think it's worth, again, thinking of journalism as a two-way street and engaging us in the conversation. And I'm sorry if my answer was totally frustrating to you, but
I think the point that you're making of asking for the truth,
yeah,
we don't get that. We get the misinformation or disinformation, but then the other part of what you're saying should happen is not happening.
So it's not even being accompanied by the truth. So that's,
I just want to jump in there. It's interesting. I think part of it, honestly, right now, there's so much disinformation when they're doing an interview. Like, they could spend their entire interview stopping after every sentence and saying, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. So I've watched, and I'm not on national news, but I've watched them really struggle with how much do I stop and fact check them in the moment versus how much do I continue to try to get more information out of them. So I see what you're saying. I think it's a fire hose of misinformation coming out from some folks right now.
How much do you worry? And obviously, most of you probably can't speak ill of your employer, but how much do you worry about your institution coloring your reporting and how much the public is going to take into account how they feel about your organization when they read your reporting?
I want to start by saying I don't worry at all about my organization. We are nonprofit, we are independent, and we are not beholden to anybody but the truth.
I agree.
Two of us are nonprofit here. Caitlin?
I worry about the phenomenon in general, but I don't worry about it in my own work because, as we've already discussed several times today, there's just no way that I'm caving. And so if that means leaving one news outlet to go to another, I'm fine with that. You know, I think all we have at the end of the day is our word and our byline, and I'm not going to publish a story that I don't believe in, and that might mean one day that I don't have a job. I've never come close to encountering anything like that. Thankfully, as you heard, I was at NPR, which is a nonprofit. I was at the New York Times, which is not, and the Atlantic, which isn't either, and which is owned by a billionaire. But I just simply haven't faced that kind of pressure in a way that I couldn't overcome, and I wouldn't cow to it. I mean, it flies in the face of everything that we've talked about in terms of why we do what we do.
And what you're speaking to, it really speaks to the trust that readers place into individual journalists, right? Which is, I think, how it kind of used to be, that readers would go to trusted journalists that they trusted, and not so much like looking at the outlet as a whole. So I think that that's a good thing. I think that that means that we need to be really trusted leaders in our communities, and that the trust goes not, institution to journalist, but journalist to institution.
How do you feel about the impact that you're leaving on the youth? And do you think that you connect at all with the youth who are growing up to make the decisions that you guys are making? And if not, why?
Well, I was just talking with Anna earlier about my evolving social media strategy because you go so quickly from being at the age where everybody considers you to be the young one, and things like whatever the newest technology is being so natural to you, speaking this language that older people don't seem to speak, and so there's this incredible power to that. And then it's just like this, all of a sudden, you're not in that group anymore. And that's kind of what I'm going through right now, where I'm like, oh, I don't know what they're talking about. And I don't speak that language. And so I was just saying today that it's been kind of a rude awakening, but it is incumbent upon me to continue evolving in the ways that I communicate stories, in framing them in a way that makes clear why they're important to young people, but also just speaking the right language. I mean, while still being authentic, right? I'm not gonna, really adopt the slang of a Gen Z person, because that would be humiliating to all of us. But it is my job to convey stories in a way that's accessible and interesting to young people. So that's my current project, or one of them.
How would you introduce investigative journalism or student journalism within college institutions in which such discussions are unfamiliar, where they have not been talked about before, or where students experience scrutiny when bringing up these concerns?
Investigative reporting shines a light, and that makes people uncomfortable. It's always worth it. You know, we did when I was at USA Today, we did a big investigation into LSU mishandling of sexual harassment allegations, and I mean, the Board of Regents came down on us. How dare you? They did not want to talk about it, and there was a lot of students on campus wanting to talk about it, to your exact point. And we stuck with it, and we told the story, and at the end, they had to, they fired some people, they adopted new rules, and the Regents came back and publicly apologized and said, we needed that, and you forced us into it, and we were uncomfortable having those discussions. But because we had the discussions, we're now a better campus and a better university. So I think we just have to keep reminding people that these are uncomfortable conversations, but we're doing it for a purpose, so that we can all be better and do better for our communities or our students.
I've talked about the threat to journalism and all of the things that are happening to shut down information, archives, schools, all of that. To me, is really concerning, and it's the big picture. What is going to be the outcome of all of that, and who's telling that story?
As far as what happens when the archives are gone and the things are shut down, we just can't let that happen. We just can't let that happen. And the fact that you're sitting here today shows you're not going to let that happen. Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, you have no idea how good for us to see you sitting there supporting journalism and wanting to hear our stories. Keep doing it. Subscribe to newsletters. Like Mia said, I don't care what your news source is, subscribe, support it. It takes money to do this. And your being here today is so meaningful to us.
So thanks to all of you for coming out tonight and for your interesting and interested questions. And we have to stop, right? Yeah. So thank you, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you.